Hey, and welcome back. On this episode of the Partition Podcast, we are joined by Dr. Kat Meyer. Dr. Kat is a licensed psychotherapist who specializes in sex, trauma, and ketamine assisted therapy. And today, she will be sharing her knowledge and expertise on how the psychedelic ketamine can be used for healing and for pleasure. Dr. Kat is also the host of the podcast Sex, Love, and Psychedelics and Erotically Wasted, and also the author of Sex, Love, Yoga. I'm excited to get this episode started, so let's jump right into it and learn more about the psychedelic ketamine. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kat. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm very good. Thank you.
Well, I'm very excited because this is a very interesting topic. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive onto ketamine, but to start, how did you get into this type of work specifically on promoting the benefits of ketamine?
Girl, it's okay. This is like a whole life story of like everything leading into one another. And it's kind of like I like to say it's one of those where it's been following what's been interesting, expanding my body, following what's alive, like the concept of eros is aliveness, and like following that. My life story coming from experiences of sexual trauma from when I was younger, and then also early adult, struggling with relationships, having eating disorders, childhood depression, like a lot of like the heavy, mental health challenges. And it started first wanting to be a sex therapist, which I didn't even know that that was even a career possibility that you could do. But it was more of like coming from the archetype of the wounded healer, like really struggling in my body and with my eroticism and relationships, and then wanting to become a psychologist from that perspective. So studying sex therapy, getting my doctorate in psychotherapy, and then along the way discovering plant medicine and energetic medicine and diving into tantra and BDSM, from my early 20s, and then just seeing how everything, not at the time, but in retrospect, seeing how everything kind of blends together, how they support one another in those realms. Ketamine, I started working with a few years ago. I it wasn't something that was even on my radar. Like I knew people doing ketamine around me at raves or at Burning Man or things like that, but it wasn't really that interesting to me. I was like, people look fucked up. Like I don't know. This doesn't look like it, yeah, laying on the couch looking vacant. That doesn't sound interesting to me, right? But then I got into understanding this from an academic perspective and getting training in ketamine because that's what was legally available at the time, and hearing from colleagues that who are masters in that field of ketamine, and hearing from them that it was very different in the clinical standpoint, in the office. And so that what piqued my curiosity. And so getting into that first, and I wanted to see how this specifically would work with sex therapy. And so in my very first ketamine assisted therapy training, I remember us doing an experiential where we were taking the ketamine and being held by one of the therapists in training. And I was using my practices of breath and sound and movement and connecting with my body because, there's this, it's classified as a dissociator. But what I experienced in that session was like, oh, I can still connect with my body. I can connect with the subtle energy bodies. I can breathe. I still have control over my body. And girl, I went into a full-blown orgasm, like energetic orgasm, like my body shaking and just ecstasy. And when I came out of this experience, we all sat in a circle and we're looking at each other, and when it came to me to share my experience, everybody was like, so we want whatever you were on. Like, what else was happening over there? And mind you, this was a room full of doctors and nurses and therapists. So it was, you know, getting to experience for myself, okay, I can use this for the work that I do. There is an erotic component to this, or there can be. And then going down this path of like, how can this work with the sex therapy, but then also how can this be used for people outside of the therapeutic environment in a way that they can access, the energetic sexual aspects, or how could this be helpful for people in their sex life too, in connection yeah. So it started there, and then it's expanded into being able to support people who are using that outside as well.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I think your first experience with ketamine, I think it would be close to mine. I feel like that's really all I've seen it at is kind of as a party drug
Mm-hmm.
per se. So,
Mm-hmm.
what makes this one different than some of the other psychedelics then, or in comparison to psilocybin?
Yeah, oh, a lot. So I have a lot of respect for ketamine and for all of these. I guess we can start with the stigma around ketamine is that it's a party drug, or you go into K-holes and that looks terrible, and yet at different doses, ketamine has a very different characteristic to it. So at lower doses, it acts as more of like an empathogen, meaning that it softens our heart. It opens our sense of vulnerability and compassion for ourselves and for the other person. Things become more loose in our ability to talk about things that we might otherwise have a difficult time with wanting to talk about. I would say it lifts the heaviness of depression or anxiety so that we can feel more and be more present to our bodies. We can have a sense of everything's going to be okay, or everything is okay. It's like this sense of expanded feeling. And in a therapeutic lens, it makes it much easier to be able to work with some of these internal challenges, traumas, heaviness, or, blocks and barriers to our life vibrancy, because we can be with some of these challenges without it dysregulating us. And that is the point where healing can occur. Or if we think about using this in regards to two people, like a couples session, it makes it so that the people can talk more openly, more vulnerably. They can feel the connection, and they can let down the guard of fear or anticipation of rejection and judgment, and really be able to talk and connect to the heart and to their bodies. And then as you get into greater doses, so a moderate dose can be more like you can go into spaces of moderate to higher. You can have more out of body experiences, or you can feel like a greater expansion of yourself, or you can go on more of these psychedelic like journeys. I would say that the energy or the texture of these journeys, though, is very different. So if we look at psilocybin, it has a very organic texture to it, or the shapes that you'll see is very organic feeling. A lot of times the symbols that come through that are very organic, nature oriented, animal oriented. And then with ketamine, I use the word analog. There's like a very analog texture to it. You can still have symbols, and you can have animals, and you can have, these otherworldly experiences. It's just a difference in texture is the best word that I can put out there. But at the same time, at those higher doses, you can still have, go into other dimensions, other astral realms, and something beyond yourself. You can go into the sky and cosmos and experience that as well.
Wonderful. So it sounds like the similarities are kind of like lower doses, you still maintain some sort of control over your body and your mind.
Yeah.
And then as you get into it, then that's kind of when you're allowed to like lose yourself into like the moments and what's going
Right.
inside.
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Now you mentioned K-hole. Now, for those of us that don't know or have experienced that, I think I saw one person, I saw a term called K-hole, and the
Yeah.
gentleman just kind of like went a little bit like he was a little bit rambunctious is what I want to say. But what is that? What happens there when that happens?
Yeah. So a K-hole, I think, is just a term that people use to call like it's you would hear this term in more of a recreational use
Hmm.
of out of body experience where you're not so connected to your physical faculties. You're not so much here. You're astral projecting into another place. But in a clinical setting, that isn't so much of a negative thing. Like there can be a healing aspect to that. You're in a controlled environment, typically very soft, or held in music, or held in a presence with another facilitator. So it's just a term that has the same experience but different connotation to it, or different perspective around it, I guess.
Absolutely. Now, I actually find this interesting that and I love psychedelics in the form of healing. I feel like most of my big traumas were resolved by using psychedelics. And so, but there is still a lot of apprehension around it because people are very nervous about it. And I feel like just with anything, there has to be some sort of preparation before you take some sort of psychedelic. So, what would
Mhm.
go into the preparation for ketamine?
Yeah, and nervousness is great. It's a level of reverence to something. You're giving reverence and honor to something that's really powerful. And so these types of medicines are really powerful. The preparation is giving time and space to not only do the research of what it is that you're about to consume. There's a difference of reverence when you're just like, oh, that's there and I'm being offered and I'm going to take it, versus taking the time to really understand what you're about to do. So understanding the compound, understanding the intention and creating the intention of why it is that you are seeking healing. What is it that healing means to you? What is it that you would like to work on or focus on or redirect your mind to? When you're in the space of ketamine or even other psychedelics, it's like your mind can go in different directions. And if you have an intention, you have something to anchor onto. You have something that you would like to return your focus to, so that you're moving towards a direction of what it is that you would like to. And you can make sense of the material. So you'll get a lot of symbols, or you get these colors and these images, and it may not make sense unless you have an intention to run that through the lens of. Um, so that I would also say the preparation is going through a vetting process. If you're working with a facilitator, make sure that you feel really comfortable with the person, make sure that you know what their background is, their training is, that your own nervous system responds well to them, that you're not feeling like on edge or feeling pressured or rushed. Um, Making sure that or doing a process of preparing yourself in regards to doing some sort of introspective work. Me as a therapist, I have people do at least 3 sessions with me, but even before we introduce any sort of medicine, because it helps them to prime the experience. I help them to get to know and connect with their body, the subtle sensations and the movements in the body, their needs, perhaps parts of them that might come up and in protection or patterns of behavior or thoughts, patterns of thoughts. And so once we start creating a practice of introspection and self-care and tuning into the body, it becomes way easier to work with once you add the medicine in there. A lot of people, I think, go into medicine work, whether it's ayahuasca or psilocybin or ketamine, really any of these, and they've never done sort of any introspection. And so they're now faced with their psyche. They're faced with their patterns and their fears and their thoughts that they've never worked on before, and that can be overwhelming. And that doesn't really help with healing if you're dysregulated, versus if you're taught how to regulate your nervous system, or you're taught that you'll come face to face with some of these things that you might have repressed or pushed down or suppressed, and all of that coming forward, yeah, is confronting and not always in a way that moves us towards healing. So that things like that can be really helpful. And also like preparing your space. If you're doing this by yourself versus doing this with a facilitator, how are you preparing the space so that it's a closed container, soft, inviting, you can relax, you can surrender into it, you can trust that there's not going to be any intrusion or anything that would be jarring because you're in such an open, sensitive, vulnerable place, and you may or may not have all access to your body movements. And yeah, so you need to know that you can trust and let go in this.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to timeframes for this, different doses, I'm sure, have different lengths. But what
Yeah.
would be the average length for this if you're doing like maybe for your first time?
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. You said it so well. It depends on the dose and it depends on the administration. Because with ketamine, there's everything from the powder, which is what you oftentimes see in recreational use or nasal sprays. Clinically, you have the lozenges, which is about 30% of bioavailability. Then you also have the IM or intramuscular, and that is like about 80% bioavailable. And then you have or 85%. And then you have intravenous, which is 100% bioavailable, meaning that, that's what's accessible to your bloodstream. And so each of these have different onsets and then come down. So the lozenges or the troches, it takes about 11 to 15 minutes of holding that in your mouth for you to reach that optimal absorption. And then that can last for about an hour to an hour and a half with a tail of afterglow, as you're coming down. Everybody's body is different. So, some people I notice their metabolism, they absorb it much quicker and then it's done much quicker. And then some people it ends up lasting a lot longer. And then with IM, I would say it's more intense. It comes on within like 5 minutes, and then it's shorter. So it's usually about an hour of that intensity. And then with the intravenous, it's instant. And then once you take that off, it comes off quicker. So it just depends on how long you're in the IV.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you're coming down from it, is this a slow progress, or will you notice?
You'll notice, but it is a slow progress. And it's interesting because I remember in one of my trainings, again, I was very fixated on like, how can this affect the body and sexuality and sensuality? And as it was coming down, I could I could feel myself return into the body. Not that I ever left the body, but it's almost like this floatiness that happens. So it's classified as a dissociator, which again, at higher doses, you're like gone out of your body. But at lower doses, it just makes like this floatiness. And then as that floatiness begins to dissipate, you feel yourself coming back into groundedness, which is an interesting texture for anybody who's done ketamine or going to do that. Pay attention to that transition because that can also bring up a lot of information for us. Some people don't want to be in their bodies, whether it's because of trauma or because of a lot of the anxiety or the pain or the depression that lives inside there. And so that transition back into the body can bring up fear or bring up anxiety. And there's a lot of potent material there that we can work with. How can I be present to myself as I return to my body or as I ground, or how can I calm and regulate myself as I'm returning into my body, having that conscious awareness there.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also just not making the situation, I don't want to use the word like worse, but I guess that's what I'm going to use. Like, don't over get excited of like, oh, I'm getting negative feelings now that I'm coming out of this. I do like your point about how there's information there. That's one of those things that you can follow and find, because then the next time you can find answers, and then maybe you'll work through it and it won't be so nerve-wracking when you come down the next time.
Yeah. And it's interesting because like in any of these psychedelic experiences or even BDSM, it's like we can get fixated on the intensity or the excitement and the like ahas and the things that are enlivening, but are we also being present to the times where we're bored or where sometimes I have clients who we do a session and they're like, oh, I didn't shoot off into the cosmos. I was just really here. And then I was like, great, there's information there. Let's look at it. So how often we don't look at the whole picture of an experience and we just focus on the intensity or the excitement. But there's stuff there too, and then not so exciting.
Absolutely. Well, I love your point about how it's so healing as well, and it can help you on all sorts of fronts. Now, when it's in relation to pleasure, how does ketamine enhance your pleasure in our lives?
Yeah. So because it's a, dissociator, or I like to say reassociator at lower doses, reassociator because again, it lifts the anxiety and the depression, helps you to feel okay in your body. With many people, like they have a hard time just being okay in their body or feeling access to something that feels good in their body. And because they're so fixated on or they've habituated themselves to focus on the negative or the pain or the fear or and so there's almost like this habit or neurocircuitry geared towards that once you lift that off, then it's like, oh, I can be in my body and it actually feels good here. So it's creating this reference point that somebody may not have ever had access to before. I've worked with clients who have, I oftentimes work with clients with sexual trauma. That's probably the most that I see in my office. And so for them, this is relieving. Like I'll see tears come into their eyes. We're like, oh my God. I'm like feeling my body. It feels good to be here. I'm not scared. And
Mhm.
so that's a reference point that now we can integrate into everyday life because they know where they're working towards now. Whereas before they're like, I don't know what safe feels like in my body. I don't know what pleasure feels like in my body. That's a term that is overwhelming for me to answer because I can't give you an answer. And which many of us take for granted because, we're like, oh yeah, I just feel safe in my body or whatever. So there's that, or even I've worked with trans clients who the ketamine helped them to be able to be in their body, whereas they didn't want to be in their body because of dysmorphia or because it was never safe to be in their body. So it creates that reassociation and the reference point that we can work towards. And then bringing in elements of like breath and movement, some of these somatic practices that can either help them to access feeling good or access energy in their body or like erotic energy or turn on in their body, or even just to break through the armor and the rigidity in their body so that, tears start coming or shaking starts coming. And then afterward, their body feels grounded and they're like, oh my God, this feels good. And so it's like putting into question these words that we oftentimes either know intellectually, like surrender. We're like, oh yeah, just let go, just surrender. But that's actually a more complex, like embodiment for many of us, or pleasure even. We take it for granted, and that it is this thing, but it's can also exist in more of the subtle bodies.
Well, I like your point about how surrendering is more complex what people think. I think until I got into BDSM in the kink world, I didn't really, yeah, use those words, we say it, oh, just let go.
Yeah.
You might just stay up in your head. But until you can really like feel it on every level of your nervous system, like in your bones and your soul and the energies that you have, then it's a
Mhm.
completely different word when you start using the word surrendering.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can't surrender until we can feel that safety in our body. And I think, again, ketamine can provide that reference point. Of course, with some of my clients, they don't feel that until like session number 4, with the ketamine, because they're facing off with the parts of them that don't want to let go or too afraid to let go. And, I think the first time that I ever did BDSM, it was like, I I can't let go. And then it was some of the first of all, it was the person that was working with me created a safety, and then also being able to the intensity of the experience like just brought my body into surrender. And then I was like, oh, that's what that feels like to let go. Got it. You
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Well, even to
Yeah.
your point about like, that's what it feels like to be safe. Like, this is what it
Yeah.
actually feels like when you don't have, especially because so many people have been raised in households that aren't particularly good for our nervous system. We don't have a
Yeah.
baseline of what safety actually is. And so
Yeah.
it's distorted. So even the level of
Yeah.
like, oh, this is safety, actually, that's not. That's just you trying to like tread water.
Yeah, yeah. And so for how important it is to have a facilitator, holding that container for us while we learn what a container is for our own selves. Because when we can learn how to be our own container, like that's healing. It's not the absence of some of these, some of these symptoms. It's the reduction of them because we have this intrinsic sense of safety. And so as a facilitator, and actually this is great for anybody who's a dominant too. The qualities of presence and attuning and their grounded resonance, their encouragement, their embodiment, and their negotiation, and those qualities create a container in which somebody can surrender or feel safe to let go. And if any one of those qualities isn't there, person can't be forced into surrender.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, you know, learning how to do that from the inside because of what's holding us on the outside.
I love that about the containers. I think holding space for ourselves, holding space for others. I do believe holding space is kind of one of those terms that we say often to people as well, but we don't actually, it's a lot of work and it's also a lot of work on yourself. Like you can be exhausted holding space for other people. So you have to have those places for yourself in place when you're helping others. And I think that's very important that we bring that up too.
Yeah, yeah. How are we doing our own work as a facilitator, as a therapist, as, even as a dominant,
Yeah.
how are we doing our own work? Are we asking the questions of why I'm even doing this work? What needs am I getting met out of this? Because as much as we would like to say, I'm doing this to help other people, there's usually some other part of us too. And the more we can develop the relationship and bring that out of the shadows, the more we have control over that versus the unconscious projection onto our clients or projection onto our lovers or, unconsciously using them to fulfill the void inside of us or the needs inside of us. But we can actually take care of those parts or we can do that work with our own therapist or, somebody who isn't our clients. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really, really important. Like, we see a lot of, we do see abuse happen, whether it's in the kink world or the psychedelic world, or really any community in this world. Or we see the abuse of power that happens, of somebody holding this quote unquote role of authority or healer role, or somebody who is uh, you know, where we're seeking help or healing from. There's automatically a power dynamic, and the more that we can be aware of that, the more that we can reduce the abuse or the being taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm. And just being aware that no matter where you go, there's always going to be an unethical person in any group. And I do feel with BDSM and kink, it gets, oh, there's so many unethical people. And I'm not going to say that there's so many, but there are some, but it doesn't mean that the whole community is that. That's not what
Right.
it's based off of.
Right. And you see it in every community. You
Yeah.
even see it in the spiritual community. And that's even trickier because we go into that, open, vulnerable, and we're not expecting it. But if for those of us who've experienced trauma, like discernment and boundaries is already skewed. So
Mm-hmm.
it becomes trickier. And then we doubt ourselves. Is this person like, I want the healing? So then do I just self-abandon in order to do what this person is telling me to do? But then we end up disempowering ourselves to give it up to the other person. So it's like, as much as I would love if all the facilitators would just take pure responsibility to be able to create those safe spaces in any of these communities, it's like we also have to take that responsibility for ourselves to learn how to discern and learn about boundaries and about self-care and what's right and what's not okay. And that's a life journey too.
Yeah, no joke.
Truly,
Yeah,
truly,
no
still
joke.
doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, those are all valid points. Now, when it comes to ketamine, is it something
Mhm.
that it opens the doors for you to see memories that you may have repressed? Like, does it allow you to do that, like in comparison to some other psychedelics, or is this more or less just removing those walls down so you're being more grounded back into yourself?
Yeah. So I would say that it happens more of like reducing the walls, reducing the emotions, the things that well, actually no, that's not necessarily true. So I will say that psilocybin, ayahuasca, some of those traditional psychedelics, classical psychedelics, are ones that can access some of the deeper rooted repressed experiences. But they can also dysregulate you.
Mm.
So there's like this experience. I've had so many people go into ayahuasca and have repressed traumas coming up and be so dysregulated because they didn't know what to do with that information, and they didn't know, and the facilitator wasn't trained in trauma work. They're trained in whatever it is that they're doing. And then coming into me, and we're using the ketamine to work with those emotions and go into it in an expanded space where they're not getting dysregulated. Now, I say that, but I've also had some clients pull up some deep, like ancestral memories and experiences and see the sexual trauma from their ancestors. I've seen that multiple times with ketamine. So there is, I think, God, I have been in these conversations with people around even people who self-identify as shamans or facilitators with psychedelics tell me that ketamine is soulless or doesn't have a spirit and everything like that. And that is not my experience. I have found a very spiritual element to ketamine. It just is it just works differently. And I think it can take us into these other realms. But it's just different. I would say it's more of an empathogen, like more of a heart opening, like MDMA in a sense, like that.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting to hear that even, I'm not shocked, I guess, to say this out loud, that even within the psychedelics, there's a little bit of like, this is better than that, and that doesn't have a soul. And like there's so much shade getting thrown around with healing. I'm not shocked, but I do find it interesting that that's being said out there.
Yeah, and yeah. It's funny because I've also met people who also work in, in realms of spirit and realms that also tell me, no, like ketamine does have its own spirit. And so it's also like everybody thinks that they own the truth, and then they like to tell other people that they're wrong. And it's just and when you add psychedelics, there is a part of psychedelics that creates this like sense of I have the truth, like conviction. Like when you're in an ayahuasca ceremony and you're like, oh, I have all the secrets of the universe, and this is true, and this is this, and then you like, yes, and like we can hold space, but also let's recognize that psychedelics speak in the language of poetry and mythos and symbols, and so how can we take the time to digest that too, and not also, I don't know, like psychedelic consciousness creates space for the multiple realities to coexist at the same exact time. So there's no absolute truth. Like, can we hold I don't know. Yeah.
I agree. Like I find it so much in the BDSM. Like, I feel like if you split the kink world versus the BDSM world, I find that the kink community has been a lot more welcoming and they're more understanding in a little bit. But when you get into like kind of like the older generations of BDSM and what a dom or what a sub quote unquote is, there's a little bit more of this same narrative of like, that isn't this because it doesn't follow XYZ. And there's a new generation of people coming up and a new generation of healers that are all about blending all of these experiences together to make the most of it.
Yeah. Can we challenge the construction of, socially constructed idea, whether it's the old guard BDSM to, how we define sex in our culture, it just, how can we, but, it comes back to structure often creates a sense of safety inside of us. So if we quote unquote know, or conviction, if somebody has conviction, then that will create safety for me. And it's just an illusion because how can we be with flexibility? How can we be with, vagueness? How can we ultimately, how can we be with the mystery of life that always exists right in front of our face? And as much as we try to create structure or certainty or conviction, it's like that isn't necessarily true, like certainty. Yeah.
And I think psychedelics can help you with that perspective because it does show you the other side of what there is, the other side of like all these things that we can't see. So like energies, like seeing ourselves, like, astral planes, all these things that, quote unquote, you can't see, but they're there. You can feel it. Right. And when you are in psychedelics, technically you are seeing it. So what is real and what's not real anymore?
Yeah, exactly. And that's so disrupting. There's so many people who want to have this certainty. And this is some of the issue that we run into is like people go into these experiences. I'll even say, even going to sex parties, you go to a sex party and this is the first time and you're like, this blows everything that I understood about the world out of the water, and what I understood about relationships or the sex or love. And so there's this, you have to compute what's happening. The cognitive dissonance between what you understood and then what you're now experiencing doesn't fit that anymore. And that can dysregulate a lot of people because how do I comprehend this? And it is a masterful skill to learn how to be able to hold differences and to hold two seemingly opposite things that coexist at the same time, or to hold that I have two different emotions about the same thing.
Mm.
That's hard to comprehend, but that's, that's the work.
Yeah. And I love that point about the two emotions for the same example. It reminds me a little bit like Inside Out, it's such a good movie to explain emotions, but that's reality. Like we've kind of, I feel like when we get older, we've designed a system where we have to think more black and white. And it's
Yeah.
about reprogramming of, no, it's always gray. It's always colorful. It's always this. It's never black and white. Whatever the case may be, it's never, ever going to be black and white.
Yeah. Or think about in BDSM where like something both disgusts you and turns you on at the same time. And we're like, okay, how can I be with both of those and not shut down or hide in shame, but really bringing that into acceptance and even compassion and care around.
Absolutely. And ketamine sounds like it would be a good platform to use for dealing with disgust because that's a really difficult
Yes.
feeling for some to identify, even.
Yeah, so much. Yes. And so with the ketamine, it allows you to still see that you're in disgust, but again, it doesn't dysregulate you. So you can actually get to know it or create a relationship with it and learn about it and talk to it. And I do want to emphasize, I've brought up BDSM multiple times and that's with your podcast. I really caution people with mixing ketamine with BDSM because it does increase the threshold of what your body can tolerate because it's a dissociator. So people don't know what their body's limits are, or they might allow certain things that they wouldn't otherwise in a sober mindset. So making sure to establish boundaries and talk about safety and not use this with things like impact play or with bondage and things like that, where you can't tell what your body's limits are. So I just want to put that out there for safety. But
No, absolutely. And I think that's very valid. Is there any other
yeah.
safety tips for using it? Like, because it
Oh yeah.
enhances pleasure, but I guess stay on
Yes.
like the slower, very connective avenue of going down that path.
Yeah. Yeah. A whole list of safety precautions. I mean, the first one is to test your substances, test all of your substances. I've unfortunately had a couple of colleagues and friends from my community die because they used ketamine, but it wasn't ketamine. It was laced with fentanyl. And fentanyl is an epidemic right now, and it's being found in a lot of substances. So always test before you consume. Then also anybody who's being involved in your experiences, have a dialogue of negotiation. What are your desires and your expectations? Making sure you both are on the same page. And one person, if one person is wanting to deepen in a romantic relationship with you and you don't, make sure you're on the same page with that.
Yeah.
And that's clear. Um, making sure that you discuss what your boundaries are. What are the limits of interaction here? And what are your needs? What are there specific needs that you have? Are there specific trauma reactions that you have? Are there specific injuries that you have or anything? These types of things that you would have in conversation for a BDSM scene. It's very synonymous here. You're about to step into a container together, and you need to make sure that there's things that are set in place. Also, not getting on hot tubs or hot baths when you're using any sort of psychedelics, because again, it changes the threshold of what you can tolerate and or your awareness of what you can tolerate. And so you're not aware that your body is dehydrated, maxed out. People pass out in hot tubs. This is one of the most dangerous things. And we oftentimes associate, I want to have a good relaxed time. And so we want to go in a hot tub or a hot bath and smoke some weed or take mushrooms or take ketamine, and they just don't mix. And so that's another really important piece.
That's interesting about the hot tubs and magic mushrooms because I don't think I've ever heard that one before. Not like I've gotten into a hot tub, but I just did not know that. So that's good. Thank you for bringing that up.
I mean, if you think about any of these can be dehydrating.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're not realizing that we're dehydrated, or we don't realize that our blood sugar is low because we're not hungry anymore, we haven't eaten in several hours. Like all of these make the body more vulnerable to fainting, to not having, and we're not aware of it. because we're in an altered state of consciousness, or because we're not connected into the body, and we're out here processing something in like, I don't know, ancient Greece, whatever.
Yeah.
But like, so it's just remembering that we are still in a human body, even if we're doing something in the astral realm. So how are we taking care? Even candles in our environment. I've had experiences where clients told me that their candle lit their kitchen towel on fire. And then when you're in an altered state, you're now in like got to take care of myself and let a crisis state. And so it's like being mindful of everything in the environment, or knocking candles over, or something. So it's just like, be mindful, have water available, have snacks available. um, you know, Remember you're in a human body.
Absolutely. Now, is there certain like foods or drinks that are good and not good while taking on ketamine? Or does it matter?
Yeah. So I would have my clients, when I'm working clinically, they fast for 4 hours from water and food. And a big part of that is because when we're working together, if they have to pee, it makes it so much harder.
Mm.
And food can make them nauseous. And so food with ketamine can oftentimes contribute to nausea or dizziness. And oftentimes you're not hungry when you're experienced, but you may be hungry right after. So I always have snacks available for my clients immediately after. I always encourage people having snacks just around, so that if you are getting dizzy, making sure to have water with electrolytes, or lemon water, something to help hydrate your body again, because you may be dehydrating it. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Now, my last question for you, I guess, with ketamine, it helps with so much, but is there any particular benefits that kind of are surprising in the ways that ketamine can help?
I mean, I think because I found that this is really helpful with sex therapy was pretty shocking. I think it shocked a lot of people, but it's also interesting because both in early academic research, where they were measuring the effects on the physiological effects on the body, some of the participants reported turn on or arousal. So it and if we think in terms of how our libido is affected, and by contextual factors both inside of us and outside of us, depression is a major cause of loss of libido. So is anxiety. So if you're lifting that, and now the person is all of a sudden reassociating with their body, that can be a turn on, because you're now lifting one of the brakes that was in place. I've had several clients work with me because of the loss of libido, men and women, and other gender identifying, and both being able to reassociate with their body and learn about what the blocks and the contextual factors that were in getting in the way of their libido was surprising to them, because they didn't think that ketamine was going to be something sexy.
Mhm.
So I think that is probably the biggest thing. And then also with couples therapy, at lower doses, like I'm thinking like lozenge, 50 milligrams of ketamine, low doses make it so that, again, it's like a heart opener. It's like an empathogen, and they can talk more easily and vulnerably. A lot of people don't think about it like that. They think of MDMA being that heart opening experience, but low doses of ketamine can really, really do that.
Wow, fantastic. Well, all of this has been super informative. Is there any like final point you just really want people to know about ketamine?
Yeah, I mean, I just come back to this stigma of it being so clinical. And it's a yes, and it's also very spiritual. There's an interesting story about the spiritual history of ketamine, where, and at the same time that ketamine was being tested in the United States for depression, the use of it for depression, it was also happening in Russia, where there was a doctor that was using this to look at how ketamine could be helpful for his clients that had addiction or depression as a result of addiction. And there were individuals in Russia who work with more mysticism, and came into his office, this doctor's office. I'm blanking on his name, but they came into his office and they're like, "Hey, we've been experiencing in our meditations that um, people are coming into the astral realm, And we followed that sensation into this office. And so we're curious, like, how are you sending people into the astral realms? And this doctor was like, what?
Oh my
Like,
God.
we're working with ketamine here. And so there's it just kind of like shows us that there is a spiritual aspect to this and a spiritual history to this. It's just like
You
that we
just
didn't even know
forward
about.
You should forward this to that guy who said it was soulless. Be like, here you go. Like, I hope this
Yeah.
email finds you well, but no, that's so funny.
I know. Yeah, true. Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah. This has been great. Where can my listeners find you and more information on your work and ketamine if they're interested?
Yeah, they can go to sexloveyoga.com or they can go to my Instagram at sexloveyoga.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I had a good time. And for my listeners, I hope you guys had a good time too. And you guys know what to do. As always, stay kinky.